prepare a really formal presentation. I figured there wouldn't be a lot of people there. So, and I'm not an expert in this field, and I'm not I don't think I'm enough of a true believer to really evangelize open educational resources. So I figured what I would do is just kind of walk through some of my experiences in trying to work with open educational resources, OERs, and I'm guessing that a lot of you have dabbled in it as well, to more or less. Maybe we can discuss kind of what your experiences have been as I do that. So let me just kind of walk through a little bit of my story. I have believed for a very long time that textbooks are evil. Maybe that's a bit harsh. Textbooks aren't evil. There's lots of great textbooks out there, but the textbook industry is evil. And well, maybe that's too harsh too. Maybe it's better to say that the textbook industry is sick and in deep trouble, and that has forced it to do some evil things. How about that? Is that better? Okay. Yeah, I can't get over why, this book costs $150 and I can't get more than $40 for this, which is, this masterpiece is vastly superior to this one. And clearly the printing cost can't be that much different, and yet somehow they have, that's how the textbook industry works these days. And now, yeah, so this is an article from Wired, but you've probably seen similar articles about, oh, look, the textbook industry is doing all this innovation by doing online books and doing rentals and doing now subscription services for textbook publishers, where you get all the textbooks you want for $100 a month or something. And the question is, is that really innovation, or is that just a very troubled industry trying desperately to kind of keep some profitability? So for a lot of, so I've kind of believed, and as a lot of kind of dying industries do, it's way outlasted my predictions. So I was 15 years ago thinking, no, it's 5 years from now, the textbook industry just can't be sustaining, and somehow it's found a way. But I still believe that this is a one-way road, and at some point, these kinds of very commercial ways of publishing educational materials is just not going to be viable. And I thought, either I can kind of hold out until the last minute and then try and figure out what to do when all of a sudden there are no textbooks on the market anymore, or I can try and get ahead of it and try and push things, I guess, in a way of kind of making textbooks obsolete in my field, as a way of kind of let's make this the way we want it to be, rather than waiting for the industry to make us do something. I don't, and so a lot of my experience has been trying out different things on what is the better way. And I still to this day don't know for sure what the better way is of distributing knowledge, essentially disseminating what of the core established knowledge of our disciplines. So this is going to be, I'll just be talking about some of my experiments, and you can tell me whether you think I'm on the right road or not. Back in
Can I ask a question first?
Sure.
So Brendan, why do you think the way we learn in college is so different from the way we learn after college? Because the thing that's always puzzled me is that most people don't go to a bookstore and buy a textbook if they want to learn about physics.
Yeah, and I think that's part of kind of what I've been thinking a lot about is do university materials really have to be that different than other things? I'll talk about that more later, but that is a thought that has kind of emerged. And one of the things that we can talk about is the linearity, right? That we traditionally have thought of a university course in a linear way, that I teach things in this order. And is that a necessary difference, or is that actually an artifact of the way that we've structured the university? And I'm thinking that myself. So anyway, so to go back to about 2005, I was involved in a project. This is kind of the product of that. A project which was produced what is called the Geographic Information Science and Technology Body of Knowledge. So what we were trying to do was, this was done by a couple of societies, and I was one of the editors on it. But we were basically just trying to document or list, and essentially, what are the core topics in our discipline, and what are the advanced topics, what are the core topics. We had a whole set of learning objectives for every one of those topics. So computer science has been doing this kind of thing for a while, and we were trying to mimic that. But it was a very valuable project. And I looked at this. I designed the cover. The cover is the table of contents. How about that? And pretty. I approached this as a way of kind of opening up knowledge. Like, let's actually establish what is our collective knowledge as a discipline. And let's kind of release that into the public. Sure enough, though, in trying to just get it printed, we ended up signing away the IP for it to one of the professional societies, who then became very stingy with that IP when we went to do a second version a few years later, and turned into a big nightmare of how to do this. So as we started working on a second version a few years later, a group, myself included, were kind of bucking the system and saying, let's do this in a completely different way that is far more open and more inclusive, and trying to actually collect the knowledge of the discipline, rather than kind of 6 people trying to do this. Let's actually try and collect the collective knowledge of the discipline and disseminate that. And the societies decided to go a different way, and I stepped away from that project. And I'll show you what they've done. They've had made some progress on this, but it's taken them 7 years to try to do a second version of a 2-year project. So, and that's how some of these things go. So about the same time, I started looking at I started getting just frustrated with the rising costs of textbooks in my classes, and just said, I can't do this anymore. And so I started looking at other resources, and a lot of you have probably looked at some of these things. So there are these open publishers like OpenStax. Unfortunately, I'm not one of the 3 disciplines that gets their textbook here, so congratulations if you are. And I don't know if anybody's used any of these, but anyway, so people have done introductory kind of online free textbooks. I remember finding this page many years ago and thinking, oh, this is awesome. The guy's done an introductory textbook on GIS. And it's free. And then I started looking through the table of contents, and it turns out this is the equivalent of about 20 pages, this entire textbook. So it didn't, it just kind of wasn't working. So I thought about kind of ways of kind of working with this myself. There are some dedicated things. For example, in my discipline, Penn State is one of the top geography programs in the country, and they have a very committed, some of you may know, very committed online education program generally, and it's kind of led by their geography program, and they've been doing online degrees for a long time, and have been very committed to developing online resources for those. But they're very similar. The materials for those online courses are freely available, but they're very abbreviated. They're very kind of, let's just get the bare minimum of content out there in these kind of online textbooks that they have. So it's kind of a good supplementary resources, but it isn't nearly as good as what I'd like to see. So I started working with kind of, well, what would it be like to develop my own resources? I started building a wiki from scratch. In fact, as an experiment, I started having students actually help write the content for it. Hoping that the students could, if I said, well, can explain this the way that you would like this explained, in a sense of, how would you explain this to somebody, to one of your peers, and hoping that would help. And it actually started to get some good stuff, but maintaining my own site was it is just hard, so I didn't want to do that, and it didn't look that great. And then one of our main software vendors built this site, which is basically a Wikimedia software. So same software as Wikipedia, but built it kind of as a public site for GIS. I thought, oh, that's exactly what I'd like to have. The content isn't great. It was kind of a starter content, if you will. But this is something we can work with. There's something there that we can make work, and it's nice because it's devoted to my discipline. So that the context is helpful there. So starting in about 2011, if I remember right, we did the same thing. So what I would do is in my classes, this is one of the advanced classes. Rather than giving the students reading materials, I would give the students each week a list of topics, basically like the key terms almost, but a list of topics. So you need to go learn about these topics. I will give you some online resources, but it's up to you to go and do the research. I would have a bunch of kind of existing textbooks in reserve, and kind of giving them a lot of resources out there. But I'd say, okay, you have to do that, and then your assignment is that you have to go in and pick one of those topics. So of all this list of topics, pick something that you're going to actually do more research on, rather than just getting a basic kind of superficial understanding. You need to go get a deeper understanding on that one topic, and then you're going to go edit the page on this site. And there was a set of criteria for what counted. You had to do a certain number of points, and creating an image counted for a certain number of points, and copy editing counted for some smaller amount of points, and adding new text counted for a certain number of points. And then I'd go in and I'd actually grade it. So it wasn't just like do it and you're done. They actually had to do a good job of it. And so I did that from about 2011 to about 2017. So about 7 years in at least one of my classes, we were doing that. And it worked fairly well. The students seemed to go out and spend the time and try and learn it and try and do their best. But there was a limit to what they could do. I mean, sometimes students do B+ work, and sometimes students are happy doing B+ work. And we all know from students writing that some students are far better at BS than they are at actually explaining something clearly, And I would actually say, I don't want to hear all the buzzwords and all the fancy language. I want you to explain this in a way that one of your peers would actually understand. And that turns out to be a fairly challenging thing for a student to do, is to actually explain something. So some students are really good at it, and some students would much rather just throw 1,000 buzzwords at you and hope that something sticks. And you've all seen that, I'm sure, in writing, and it was no different here. So occasionally there was some issues. But it was improving. So we were getting these things not up to textbook quality, but there was getting some things. And fortunately, this is not a widely recognized site. It's not heavily used. So it was a good kind of sandbox where there was kind of a low pressure site where they could do some things, feel like they were contributing to public knowledge. And they really liked that. They really like, hey, I can post this and like my mom can read it, but it wasn't like super high pressure, like if they were writing journal articles. Unfortunately, this was an open source kind of experimental project done by a software vendor who this is not their mission in life, it's to make money. And so eventually I think they started to lose interest in it. By about 2017 or 2018, the site started to kind of decay. It was obvious that people were not, it was not being well maintained. And now it looks like the CSS actually loaded today. Most of the time, this page just comes up as kind of plain text, and it's just not working very well. So that started to happen a few years ago. I thought, okay, this is not sustainable. This site's not going to catch on. It was a great sandbox, but it's not catching on. So I started doing a kind of a sub thing where their final exam in this one class was that they had to take what they had kind of learned and take one topic and go even further on that one topic and make a significant contribution to Wikipedia. So that was their final exam. Just one topic. I want you to be good enough to explain one topic, get it into Wikipedia, and it has to stick. Right? That was one of the rules, is it had to stick. That if somebody went and said this is not kosher and took it off, then you didn't get the points. So you had to make it good enough that it would actually be good. It would work. I did that for a couple of years, and they actually made some really good progress. We did find that there were a couple of pages not to contribute to because people felt they kind of owned that page and were very particular about what got edited there. And then, but there was a limit. Still, there's a limit to the quality of content that undergraduate students can write for public consumption. So then in 2020, last summer, I decided to just bite the bullet. And so I took a couple months in the summer and just started working on pages on Wikipedia myself. Just said, I had talked to a lot of my colleagues, tried to get some buy-in. Hey, let's work on this together. Everyone just kind of gave me a collective yawn. And so you get a lot of these, go for it. You know? So I went for it. So I went in and just started working on kind of, went through a lot of the pages, started with cartography because it was for a cartography class, and just started going through a lot of the pages and saying, what is there? Halfway readable. What is there that is like really missing? Ended up having to add about 4 or 5 new pages that weren't covered at all. Went in on about 20 others and did some really heavy editing and adding new content, expanding pages. And then for a second class last winter, I worked on about 3 other pages that were short.
So you work in how are you doing this in the class?
Oh, this is just me now.
So it's during the class time. So this will help your class.
Yeah, now so I'm assigning this as the basic readings now for the class. I'm just saying, go look at these Wikipedia pages, and as well as some other readings. I'm assigning other readings, but this is kind of the get the definitions kind of part of the readings.
What if someone else goes in and changes your page?
Well, we'll talk about
Okay.
that. For better or worse, actually, both. That's not happening a lot. So, anyway, so I'm kind of saying, well, more advanced stuff. Here's other readings, but if you just need the definitions for these key terms, just go look at these pages. And now I've started. I was asked to pick up a new class this winter, and so I'm doing that. That's more of an intro class. So these have all been mostly more kind of intermediate, upper division classes, and now I'm actually going to try it as a partial for an intro class. So that's going to be a bit extending. Although we are working, that's going to be probably take a few years to really overhaul the entire discipline. And so we're just working on a couple of high priority things right now. Some pages that are really missing. So there's one here. This is an example of a page that always an ad here. So this is an example of a page that is actually a fairly core part of our discipline of GIS and had no coverage at all in Wikipedia. So this is something that is really missing. And so this is a page that I had to create from scratch. Took me about 4 or 5 days of work to do this. So that's kind of the history of this. So let me give you some observations of kind of my what I've learned from this experience. So first off, the positives, the opportunities. One is, as you said, Joe, that the potential is here to say, well, what's the difference between a university course textbook and just trying to get the established knowledge of the discipline out into the open? And so this kind of would accomplishes both purposes in a sense. And so it releases that knowledge into something. Another advantage of it is that an opportunity is that personally, it's been a very enlightening experience. That is, having to actually write this content is a different experience than writing a textbook because of kind of the way that encyclopedia pages go and having to write a bunch of them. One of the things that's really been interesting to me is having to investigate the intellectual history of these individual concepts. We're used to kind of a history of our whole discipline, but having to say this one individual concept, like who came up with that concept. Sometimes that's very well established because the person named it after themselves, or something. But a lot of times it's not. A lot of times it's, especially with a lot of technology things in my discipline, they just kind of appear in software all of a sudden and people take them for granted, and it's not as clear kind of who came up with the idea. And so that's actually been a very interesting thing for myself of trying to learn about that. The other opportunity is for just starting to try to build a community consensus on this knowledge. In my subdiscipline, which has been around for about 50 years, is in many ways kind of dysfunctional. It's run by like 10 different professional societies instead of one. It can't even decide what to call itself. GIS is kind of too narrow, and geospatial, which has gained a lot, is a bleeding adjective, which you should never call a discipline an adjective, because everyone wants to say geospatial what. Geoinformatics is very popular in Europe, which means the Americans can't stand it. So it just, we don't even know what to call ourselves. And there's lots of basic terms that we've never actually sat down and all agreed on what to call it. So there's like several people have claimed to invent some term for something, and those terms have kind of been used. And so we actually have concepts that have like 4 parallel terms, and we haven't been able to agree because nobody's actually sat down and said, we all need to sit down and agree on this. So this has the opportunity, I don't know how much promise it has, but it has the opportunity to help the community kind of come together and say, hey, let's actually agree on some of these things. Now, my challenges list is a lot longer than my opportunities list. What I've found, I've talked to the students over the years about this a lot. A lot of students really like the nonlinear way of reading, of saying, here's just a list of topics and you go learn about those topics. Some students have a really hard time with it. They want to just say, read these 10 pages, hate them, but you're done with it, And there's always students who just won't read, but do what you want with that. But I have had students that actually said, hey, you know what? I find myself, and we're all nerds here, so we've probably all gone down the encyclopedia rabbit hole. And so there are students that really like that. They're like, hey, I started reading about this page, and then I went on to this page, and I went on to that page. I spent 3 hours, and I was really interested in this topic that I didn't know anything about. So it has the potential for that, but it doesn't work for everybody. Not all students really work in that nonlinear way. And there's been a lot of studies that show that people just don't get as much out of studying things on the screen as they do in books. And that's just something we're kind of, it's kind of a fact of life. There is this whole kind of, you get what you paid for, right? I mean, this is free. It has not had a huge amount of editorial work put into it. There's no peer review on these kind of things. I mean, that Wikipedia has this kind of very lax system of peer review, but it's not really very strategic. Of course, then you can say, well, yeah, but is any textbook really peer reviewed in to the degree that it ought to be? I mean, I find a lot of textbooks that I'm like, why did they say that? I just totally disagree with that. It's totally wrong. And most of us, when I don't know, most of us, me, when I assign a textbook, I'm often only assigning half of the chapters because my class doesn't cover the other half of the chapters. So, yeah, I'm not sure what the quality, if we're comparing against the actual thing. Some material in textbooks, another challenge, some material in textbooks does not easily lend itself to an encyclopedia model. Some of the way that you'd explain something in a textbook is not the same as the way you'd explain it in a quote encyclopedia article. For example, in cartography, a lot of textbooks will have a lot of advice about design. Hey, you ought to do this, you ought to do that, you ought to do that. That's like totally inappropriate in an encyclopedia article. Although it can be turned into something if you turn it into, according to so-and-so, this established model, these are the guidelines, or the studies show this. But that takes a little more work, and a lot of textbooks don't bother to do that extra work. And so I've had to, in some places, kind of do that extra work to say, what are the, you actually should justify this advice. And in many cases, Wikipedia kind of stretches the encyclopedia model. There's ways in which there's lots of pages in here that wouldn't fit as a true encyclopedia anyway. So maybe there's some strengths there. Second, there's a pretty established knowledge that getting really good content in this model, this kind of crowdsourcing model, needs wide authorship. Has anybody heard of Linus's rule? So Linus Torvalds is the guy that invented Linux, the operating system Linux, open source. And he had a rule that basically you needed 10 people to edit something, but in this crowdsourcing model, kind of not without editors, without kind of oversight, 10 people needed to edit this before kind of the quality got up to the same as if you had like an expert editor. And that's actually been tested in a variety of these crowdsourcing environments, and it's kind of held sway to a large extent. So I'm fairly uncomfortable with the fact that right now, a lot of the pages in cartography sound like me. My students will read it, they're like, this sounds a whole lot like what they're talking about in class. I'm like, I don't know what else to say about this other than what I say in class. So
makes it easy to identify those that are plagiarizing.
that's right. So you asked the question about, well, what if other people edit it? Well, in one respect, I'd really like to have a lot of other people edit it, because I want to see kind of what's the collective wisdom on this, not what do I think. And if it starts to move the page away from what I think, well, that's kind of the way things go. There are very few pages, I will say, in my discipline that have gotten into any kind of edit wars, or none that are locked down because they're too controversial. Some of your disciplines may be different than that. But there are a few pages where some people have kind of really taken ownership of it. One of them, I have to kind of ask permission before I can make an edit to any of the pages in this kind of area, this topic area. But he's one of the world's leading experts on the topic, so I will totally defer to him, and happy to ask his permission. So it's biggest. So that's the biggest challenge, is trying to get more people involved to really do this well. It's just hard to get more people involved. There's no academic credit for doing something like this. And I'm not proposing that there be academic credit for doing something like this. I basically am treating this as class prep. I'm not putting this on my resume that I'm doing a lot of this stuff. Because there's not the peer review quality that you'd have for anything else. Even an encyclopedia, a printed encyclopedia that many of us write articles for, that has a lot more peer review than this does. So I'm not saying that this ought to count for as much as a journal article or anything like that. Although I will say that if a discipline wanted to do this, and I know that some disciplines have, I want to say that several years ago, about a decade ago, psychology might have taken on a project to try to improve the Wikipedia coverage. It's either psychology or economics, and I can't remember which one it was. But I saw a presentation where they had said, well, our society actually made a committee, and we actually worked on trying to improve this as a group. I have not been able to get much traction with my discipline on doing that, but I decided not to wait to get that. But if you want to say, okay, we're going to actually have now a group of people who will act as editors. Wikipedia has the platform that you could do full peer review on these kinds of things, and actually establish, that people are kind of taking ownership of certain topics and things like that, and acting as editors. Obviously, there's no financial gain here. There's no IP. So a lot of the things that as academics we kind of the coin of the realm, there's none of that. So that's a problem. And I've seen that. This is the last thing I'll say, but I've seen that in. I mentioned this body of knowledge project. So when they went to the second edition, they decided to do this actually in a more encyclopedic way. So they said, we're going to take each topic and we're going to have somebody write an article about it in a much like an encyclopedia. It'll be peer reviewed and although, yeah. But they've had a difficult time trying to get buy-in for this. So they've been working on this now for about 7 years. This is one topic. This is about 10. One topic area. And the ones that are in bold are the topics that have a complete article. The ones that are not in bold are ones where they basically copied out the very kind of rudimentary text that we wrote in this book, and it has not been changed yet. And the ones that are in italics have no content whatsoever. So after all this time, they're having a very difficult time getting people to actually contribute in this model. Now, this is a model where you're asking someone to write an entire article about something. So that's a big ask when there's kind of no credit. I mean, you get some authorship credit. They're offering people essentially what you would have in an encyclopedia, same kind of level of peer review, same kind of length as an encyclopedia article, which, when it comes time for rank and status, that counts for that much. So it's a difficult ask to get people involved. All right, that's my experience. So I don't know if people want to talk about your own experiences or if there's any questions or what you think about this. So am I a prophet of open educational resources? No. I believe in the idea, but I have not seen yet the solution to how to make it work to its full potential.
So I guess one thing you shared that prompted me I love the intellectual history of ideas. I hadn't thought about that as a feature of Wikipedia pages, but it made me wonder of the papers that I've published, which Wikipedia page would my new discovery contribute to? And I guess I was just trying to think of your thoughts on, would that cause the way we think about our research findings differently? Would it change the way we maybe talk about them with the public? Because we don't obviously get credit for being in the media, but sometimes when our work is in the media, we get more citations. I'm wondering if this kind of model could lead to a world in which we're more aware of what each other are doing, because there'd be one place where I could read all this, everything we know about that specific topic.
One of the interesting things that I had to kind of rethink as I think in this model, Wikipedia actually in their style guide, they actually have an expectation that they want to have more secondary sources than primary sources cited, which at first glance for an academic, you're like, whoa, that's totally wrong. But what they want to do is they want evidence that this is established knowledge. They don't want you published, they don't want your Wikipedia page to have, hey, here's what so-and-so said this year, you know. They want, you know, what is it that everybody kind of accepts as the core knowledge? But it has made me think about, in my own research, what have I done that has contributed to established knowledge, you know? And which of those articles have become seminal to the extent that now it is part of the collective wisdom, and which articles kind of went nowhere in that sense. You know, this was something really interesting, but it didn't really contribute to any future textbook on the subject. You know, it's an interesting thought about that. But I think we don't. I admire textbook writers because that's kind of their job, is to cull from all of this stuff that gets written. What is it that is now kind of accepted wisdom? You know, and I think the community as a whole. I worry about having 4 people that do that for us. I would be nicer if our entire disciplines were better at kind of doing that kind of that editorializing about what is it that is now. Review articles go a long way towards that, right? Yeah, it was an enlightening experience of doing that, of saying, boy, a lot of people have talked about this, but not a lot of it has really kind of entered that establishment.
So would you suggest that a non-tenured faculty member try this?
Under no circumstances whatsoever. Yes, this is completely sacrificed time, which is obviously the reason why it's hard to get anybody to do it, right? So, yeah.
But if we change the rules a little bit so that those who are willing to make the sacrifice get some credit for the contribution to society?
So the overarching principle in rank and status decisions is and ought to be, is there some guarantee of quality, right? Is what you're doing having an impact and having quality? Now there's impact here, although nobody's going to cite Wikipedia pages if they know what they're doing, right? My students, you know, we had so long saying that Wikipedia was like this terrible thing that is damaging to society, and I tell my students now, I say, here's my philosophy of Wikipedia. It is when I need knowledge, when I need to learn something, it is always the first place I look, and it is never the last place I look, right? So it'd be hard to actually document the impact that your work is having. And it'd be very hard to give impact to document the quality. And so, again, if you could show that at your discipline, there's some kind of a committee in your professional society that has taken this on, that there is an editorial process now that that the society, or that my discipline is committed to this, and they are actually now doing peer review of these articles, and they're making changes and stuff, then you could make that case. But I think by itself, I wouldn't even try to make the case that this is a scholarly work at all.
Does it measure page views? Do you get a measure of page views in some way, like traffic or anything?
You could, yeah.
Not that, I guess here's the biggest issue I'm dealing with is, like, right now, the way I learn is I learn by reading books, using Wikipedia, and listening to podcasts or watching TED Talks. But those are not at all what I use to teach my students. So I'm really struggling. Like, I guess it's my internal struggle. I'm trying to figure out why it is that, because the other thing I worry about when I talk to college students is they've stopped reading books during college. Like, I ask them, like, what's the favorite book you've read recently? And they're like, oh, I haven't read a book in a while. Or they're like, does a textbook count? So I'm trying to figure out, like, is college just a unique type of learning that we should do differently? Or are we somehow doing our students a disservice by, like, teaching them how to learn in a way that they will never use again?
For me, that varies. So, like, in my advanced classes, which tend to be fairly technical, I try to push them into that nonlinear, teach them, when I'm teaching them, here's how you're gonna be learning for the rest of your life in this nonlinear way, you should get used to it, right? But in an intro class, especially in a general ed class, that'd be a really hard transition to make. Because we do have this idea that there's this pedagogical, there's a linearity to it. You've got to teach them this and then this and then this and then this, you know. I don't know if that's right or not, but it certainly is what we all assume. Any other thoughts on that?
I've used TED Talks in an intro level class. When we were all locked down and going over Zoom, I just couldn't bring myself to ask anybody to read an intro level textbook. I just couldn't do it. So I went out and I found YouTube videos and TED Talks given by the people who I actually was going to have them read. And I thought this was going to be fantastic. And the students dismissed it as, this is the first time I've ever taken a class that was just popular information. And it's the same information, but the delivery method was different because I think some of these people wanted to dismiss what was being said because they didn't agree with it as well. I don't like the medium that this was delivered through, so I don't have to pay attention to it. So there's that other side of that as well, that those that are looking for an excuse to dismiss are going to find it. Those that really were already, buying into the topic were all about the TED Talk, because then it was just kind of a different approach to it, a different way of accessing information that's probably more in line with how they would learn beyond the classroom. But it's just, I did not anticipate the backlash I got from the half of the class that obviously hadn't bought in anyway.
I have found the same thing, that when I assign online readings, the respect for the information is different. Even if they're understanding and comprehending it far better than the text that we used to assign, their respect for the information is less,
Yeah.
Oh, this is way over my head, which means it must really be good,
So with the students that come to BYU this coming fall, they would have gone through high school, a good portion of it, online. I wonder if that would change their attitude of where the information comes from.
I have a lot of concerns about that, but
I'm just throwing that out because honestly, the students responding the way they did to him, they got that probably going through their elementary, high school years. It wasn't something they were taught at home about. And with the change with COVID, maybe people will be more willing to accept online.
possibly. Although when I have to convert my textbooks to TikTok videos, I think that's time to retire. Did you have a comment?
I think to go back to the comment about Joe's comment about is the kind of learning that students ought to be doing in college different than at other times. I think it is. I think this is the time, because I think reading, as the research you cited, I think they learn deeper and in more significant ways if they're actually reading books. And I've asked, just the other day, I asked my TAs, I was thinking of substituting a reading for a documentary about the same topic. And my TAs who are, sympathetic to the students, having a little less work to do and enjoying it more, said, hey, we think they'll watch it at a faster speed, or they'll watch it and they won't get out of it what they would if you have them read this chapter. And so I think, I'm a historian, so I like books, but I think there's a big difference. When I go look up stuff, or I listen to TED Talks or podcasts, it's interesting, it's enjoyable, but a couple of days later, I can't remember much more than that I enjoyed it.
I'm often amazed at how, now that I have kids who are college students, and some of you are in that, a lot of you are in that boat. boy, it opens your eyes as to what the student experience is like, you know. There was you as a college student, there's all these strangers as a college student, now it's your kids as college students, just kind of a whole different environment. Anyway, so multiple of my kids have done asynchronous lectures during COVID here. And they're watching them at double speed. And I'm like, why are you doing that? They're like, well, because I want to get through it fast. I'm like, well, are you gonna learn as much? Sure, yeah, I'm gonna learn as much. And then you're like, did you? No, that's odd. You know? I don't understand. I'm sitting there watching it. Why am I not getting as much out of it? That doesn't make any sense, but it makes a lot of sense. But yeah, the problem is the students kind of don't know what's good for them, you know, which puts a lot of burden on us. Do we know what's good for them? I'm not so sure, but yeah. But the question then is, given some, you know, questions about the long-term viability of this industry, of the textbook industry, what do we do? You know, do I try and do I hold out and, you know, make them do paper books for as long as I possibly can and try to find books that are not going to kill them cost wise? Or do I try and make the best of kind of the new technology that I may not agree with completely, but that's the way the world's going to be, and I somehow have to get ahead of it instead of having to react to it after it's kind of out of my control. And that's kind of the tack I've taken, is which is a very kind of you know, Christiansen kind of the disruptive innovation kind of thing is, you know, the disruptive innovation often is not as good, and eventually it becomes as good, but for a while you're kind of like, why did we pick this instead? It's lousy. But that may be the eventual solution. So I don't know. No, a lot of answers. Any other thoughts? These are really good, interesting thoughts.
I was dismissive of stuff on the web, but I would highly recommend your YouTube videos about the Bonneville Shoreline Trail.
Oh, thank you.
You're
Well,
doing great work there.
that is that's a fun project, but similar kind of thing of I don't know if I'm really getting the point across with having to edit something down that much. Thank you.
Thanks, Brandon. Thanks for doing this today. Appreciate it.
No.
Yeah.
So for economics,
Yeah.
do you use
So what did you
open
win?
source materials? for
I
economics?
don't. I was gonna ask Brandon about he's most concerned about the immorality of textbook prices. So what I do is I actually